Welcome to our sixth Author Happy Hour, brought to you by the Kentucky Book Festival, a program of Kentucky Humanities. I'm Sarah Woods, the director of the Kentucky Book Festival, and I'm so glad you've joined us this evening. Just in time for Halloween, next week at Thursday at 7 p.m., we'll have 4 authors of crime fiction with us for our final Author Happy Hour. It'll be really fun. We hope you'll join us. You can register at kyhumanities.org or join us on Facebook Live next week. The Kentucky Book Festival will continue next month with programs planned from November 9th through 14th with authors including John Grisham, Nikki Finney, and many more. Find more information at kyhumanities.org and follow us at kyhumanities on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook for updates and announcements. Tonight, we'll hear from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicholas D. Kristof, whose most recent book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, was co-written with his wife, Cheryl Wudunn. Cheryl's unfortunately unable to join us this evening due to some family business. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Deidra Dennie, who will introduce Mr. Kristof, I would like to tell you a little bit about Deidra. Tonight's session is sponsored by Transylvania University. Deidra Dennie is a native of Louisville, Kentucky. She and her husband, Anthony, have 2 sons and a recently addition grandson in their family. Reading was an early skill that she passed on to her children and hopes to instill in her grandson. Dr. Dennie is the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Transylvania University, where she enjoys working with her colleagues and collaborating with the student body to get in good trouble. She has worked in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education and private industry for the past 17 years. She is newly transplanted in Lexington, Kentucky, and excited to grow roots here. We're glad Deidra and Nicholas could join us for this conversation, and we hope you enjoy their talk.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Today I'm joined by author Nicholas Kristof, who wrote a book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. He and his wife describe what they saw in Kristof's hometown of Yamhill, Oregon, where the loss of well-paying union jobs and other upheavals have left the community in peril. Kristof and Wudunn follow several of Kristof's ex-schoolmates with whom he grew up with in Yamhill, Oregon. They examine a multitude of challenges, including unemployment, healthcare, drug and alcohol use, and the prison system. So welcome, Mr. Kristof.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
Thanks. So this was really a great book. It drew me in with Dee Knapp's story about being shot at by her husband with a I thought, where in the world is this book going? Now I'm intrigued and I'm all in. And so tell me, what compelled you to write this?
Well, you know, Cheryl and I were reporting around the world, covering humanitarian crises around the globe, from Yemen to Sudan to Myanmar. And we gradually realized that there was a humanitarian crisis unfolding right here at home in my beloved hometown. And I grew up on this family farm. I'm actually physically on the farm right now. You may hear a dog barking or a chainsaw going, which will be, you know, a sign of that authenticity. But there was a crisis unfolding here, and I'm still close to the kids who were on my number 6 school bus, and a quarter of them have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. These deaths of despair. And, you know, I tried to kind of process what was happening, and I thought, is this something about my bus or something about Yamhill? And no, it was increasingly clear this was an American problem, and that for 50 years, the country had failed many, many workers, and those job losses had led to cataclysm, resulting in this is our, here, we have a, Connie, you want to say hi? Connie?
Connie?
Yeah.
I just real, Kristof, that you're on your farm, actually.
Yep. Yeah, she will wants a contribution here. But it's kind of heartbreaking to witness this happening here in a place that I knew so well, to people who I knew so well. And you mentioned D. Knapp. So the Knapps were the family who got on the bus right after I did each morning. The 5 Knapp kids, Farland was my grade, his brother Zealand, his brother Nathan, their baby brother Keelan, his sister Regina. And they struggled. Farland lost his job and descended into, he abused alcohol and drugs, died of liver failure as a result. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from injecting drugs. And Keelan was actually, when the book came out, we were going to do some joint events. He had survived because he spent 13 years in prison. But then in March, after COVID hit, he lost his job and he died of a heroin overdose. And so, 5 kids looking forward to a better life, a family that had exemplified upward mobility in the 20th century. These kids dying one after the other. And so we wanted to explore what went wrong around America and try to use the kids on the number 6 bus in part as a prism through which to examine that problem.
Great. Yeah, I was going to ask you about Keelan later on, and I'm sorry to hear that he passed away. And we're not talking about people that passed away in their 70s, 80s, or 90s by any stretch of the imagination. These were relatively young people, younger-ish, if you will, and they were in their 40s and 50s, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So
that's why life expectancy fell in the United States for 3 years in a row for the first time in 100 years. And that was before COVID. And now COVID has in many ways exacerbated those problems.
Yeah, this book is very timely based on the time we kind of find ourselves in. There are 3 themes in your book, and I want to unpack each one if we can. The first one was about the working class is collapsing. What did you find to be responsible for this deterioration of the working class?
So, it's interesting. So Yamhill is a overwhelmingly white community. And in the 1990s, when African-American communities were struggling, I think there were a lot of people in Yamhill and in a lot of other white areas who said, this is a reflection of deadbeat dads, of people making bad choices, not showing personal responsibility. And meanwhile, there was a great Harvard sociologist, William Julius Wilson, who said, no, it's about jobs. It's about the loss of good jobs. And he was exactly right, because when the loss of good jobs came to Yamhill, when they went to Kentucky, when they went to northern Maine, you saw very similar patterns. And so I think it's partly about the loss of working class jobs and about the fact that no longer were working class jobs capable of raising a family to a kind of a reasonable middle class life, partly because of the loss of unions. The Knapps, who we talked about, their dad laid pipe, sewer pipe particularly. It was a union job, and it paid well enough that the family could buy their first home. When Farland turned 16, the family got him a Ford Mustang, and I was incredibly jealous. But that now somebody who lays pipe, there's just no hope of living that kind of a life. And that happened across America. And I think fundamentally the loss of those jobs, the loss of unions, the loss of a sense of hope for a better trajectory, I think drove much of the self-medication, for example, with alcohol and drugs.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities between what has happened in Black America in the 80s and 90s and what is now happening to white America in the 2000s. And the trajectory is the same. If something doesn't change, then it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. People are not going to be able to figure out how to get out of homelessness or poverty if we don't do something. And so that leads me to the second theme in your book, which is the working class is suffering due to social policy mistakes and gratuitous cruelty. And so people, you're gonna have to read the book because he talks really in depth about this. I want you to touch on just some of the examples of the mistakes in policy and the cruelty that you have found.
Yeah, I think that, look, I mean, we have, I think that a lot of us delude ourselves to thinking that these job losses are an inevitable consequence of globalization or mechanization. And look, those were stresses on the system. Germany, Canada, they face real problems from globalization, mechanization, but they don't have suicides at a 75-year high. They don't have kids on buses, a quarter of whom are dead from these deaths of despair. They don't have 70,000 people a year dying from overdoses. These are a consequence of choices that we made as a society. And in 3 US counties, you have life expectancy in the US that is shorter than in Cambodia or Bangladesh. And that's not because those infants are showing a lack of personal responsibility or are making bad choices. That's because we as a society are. And because fundamentally, I think we don't care. We, we have the resources. We're the richest country in the history of the world. We have the toolbox. We know what has worked in other countries. But what we don't have is the political will to address these problems. And we don't have the framework, I think, to understand that it's not about pointing fingers. It should be about offering helping hands. And, we, we tried to write Tightrope as a way to kind of remind everybody of the human toll across so much of the country, and that we do have ways to make a difference if we just care.
So yeah, the social policies that are out there, and then this belief, and you write about it in the book, that America thinks it's so wonderful for kids, right? That we test lower on math skills in high school than other countries, yet we have this inherent, innate belief that we are just, as my kids used to say, all that in a Hot Wheel track. And
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. We have this notion of America's number one. And look, I mean, in military power, we're number one. Probably in cultural influence around the world, we're number one. We do in cutting edge medical care is probably the best in the world. But on the other hand, we rank around 95 in access to medical care. A kid in the US is 55% more likely to die by age 19 than a kid in other advanced countries. And so, education, the best universities in the US are probably the best in the world. And yet 1 in 7 kids doesn't graduate from high school. So many other countries have passed us in high school graduation rates and college attendance. And so we are capable of such heights, and yet we seem indifferent to the fact that that capacity does not reach so many Americans, and then we blame them for our failures.
so yeah, that goes into also the mindset that one can pull oneself up by their own bootstraps, and that individual responsibility is how you fix your lot in life. But in your book, you talk about that individual responsibility and pulling oneself up by bootstraps that you don't have because you don't have boots is not going to fix poverty or homelessness.
That's that phrase, pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, that used to mean exactly the opposite of what it does today. In the 19th century, it was a mocking phrase to refer to something that was impossible. And then somehow in the 20th century, it became an instruction for what, poor people should do. And we have this personal responsibility narrative that I think has become a real impediment to better policy. And it, we make it all about personal responsibility. And, there's no question that so many of the kids on my old school bus made irresponsible decisions and they made bad choices. Farland cooked meth for a while. He should not have been cooking meth. He should not have been taking it. But that was a trajectory that so many people are on from infancy. And we as a society invested huge amounts incarcerating the naps, but not in educating them, not in giving them job training, not in giving them drug treatment programs that might have made the world a difference for them and for their children. And so, sure, personal responsibility is real, but so is our collective responsibility. And I don't think we faced up to that, Deidra.
So let's talk about Clayton Green a little bit in the book. And I know that he's passed away as well, correct?
That's correct.
He got kicked out of school, I want to say in the 8th grade for fighting.
9th grade. Yeah. He was his whole family was they were good buddies of mine. His sister Cindy was in my class. His brother Kevin then ran cross country and track with me. And Clayton worked on our farm at times. They were just deeply loyal people. Cindy passed away first, then Kevin, and then Clayton. And one of the hard things, Deidra, about writing the book was I was a little bit afraid of perpetuating prejudices. Clayton, he was 400 pounds. He had this big beard. He had abused drugs and alcohol. And I didn't want people to look at that picture, to hear his history and say, oh, this just shows it's all about bad choices. And I talked to him about whether we could say in the book that he had cooked meth, for example. And at first he was reluctant. And then, but I said that this is just who you are. It's part of your history. And that people should understand that full complexity. And he agreed. And we felt a lot of responsibility in showing that here's a guy with enormous talent. And the fact that he never took high school chemistry and yet reputedly made quite brilliant math, if that talent and skill and intelligence, if he'd been able to graduate through high school and had been able to harness that intelligence for making products or serving the community, we would all be so much better off. And that's what we were trying to convey, that there were real failures here, but Clayton wasn't, he wasn't worse than his dad who'd been a cement finisher. They were all talented, and somehow in our generation, on our watch, those jobs went away and people tended to be propelled toward bad choices.
Nick, because of the power of virtual and Zoom meetings, you had to move a little bit because the sun was shining in your face. You were squinting. So
exactly. So this is another glimpse of the farm here. A nice cedar right behind me.
So thank you so much. So diving right back in your book, you share some very disturbing observations. And I'm going to pick up on page 182 particular, because that really said a lot to me for a number of reasons. So in the book, you say that a person needs to know whether or not the judge has had lunch before, so you want to get adjudicated early in the morning before he's, so he's not hungry. You also need to know whether or not his college team won or lost the night before. How is an average Joe Blow person who maybe doesn't have resources of any, depth or breadth have a chance in our current legal system if I need to know that much about the judge?
Deidra, it's just so frustrating. We find that, there's been a lot of research about this because, of course, we have a huge, a lot of data that we can crunch. And as you say, judges impose harsher sentences when they're hungry, so like right before lunch. They impose harsher sentences when their college team has lost a game. They impose harsher sentences on African Americans and corresponds to the complexion of the African American. The darker the complexion, the harsher the sentence. And
Let me just also do harsher sentences if they're up for election, and if they want to be seen as being tough on crime, then defendants don't have much of a chance.
That's right. And this is not what justice is supposed to be about. And I guess more broadly, it strikes me that so much of this has been tied to the war on drugs, which I think was maybe the biggest single policy failure that the US has made over the last 50 years. I think that one thing that conservatives basically got right was the importance of an intact family structure, that really does improve outcomes for children, especially boys. We don't fully understand why, but on average, boys have better outcomes when there is a dad at home. But what has devastated family structure and removed a lot of dads from the picture? It's mass incarceration and the war on drugs. And if one is going to preach the importance of intact families, then one also has to address the way incarceration has been so devastating, not only for the dads, but also for their kids, and especially their sons.
And we now have this uptick in women going to prison as well for much longer sentences, which again decimates the family, because you're removing the parents from the home. And I get that in some cases, maybe that is the best thing for the kids to be removed because there's just so much devastation in the family, but that's not always the case. I was doing a little research not too long ago and found that in some cases, if once parents of color and children of color get in the system, that their outcomes are not very good. So if I'm a social worker, the chances of me taking away a child are much higher if that family is Black or of color than if they're white. And it's just like, wow, if the circumstances do not met up to you needing to remove these children, why do you do that? But it's because there's racism or systemic racism in a lot of the things, and that we see as policy, that we see as law, that we see as the right way to do things. And we hold people of color to a much higher standard than we hold white people, basically, right? And so, and it causes trauma. So the poverty experiences that the kids on bus number 6 have, that have created this trauma, that have created PTSD, are some of the same outcomes that racism causes, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And, I'm glad you mentioned the foster care system. The foster care system in America has been just a catastrophe. And outcomes, whether it's high school graduation rates, likelihood of attending college, contact with the criminal justice system, in case of girls who often end up being trafficked, are just horrendous. And yet we've continued with this system and removed kids from families. And, as you say, I mean, there are often difficult determinations to make, and often the household is complicated, but there have been experiments with, working to find a relative, for example, coaching that relative, supporting that relative, and the outcomes in that case are just much, much better than pulling that child away and throwing them into the foster care system. And as you say, we're much more likely to do that with kids of color. And when we have this evidence about how bad the outcomes are, and we continue with this system, it's just unconscionable, how bad those outcomes are. And it's one more example of just the way the system is rigged against against children who are disadvantaged children, and especially children of color.
You know, you talk about escalators in your book, and so the third theme in your book is about compassion and empathy. And I look at compassion and empathy as an escalator, if you will, because if you have a social policy that's not working, you would think that it would just, you know, we need to change that. We need to tweak what's not working or change the policy completely, do something different so you have different outcomes. And you know, there are organizations, and you write about two, or you mentioned two, Skillful and Tech Hire. Both of those are programs that operate here in Kentucky. Why are these organizations so important to providing these escalators, that, as you call them, out of poverty, out of homelessness, out of despair?
Deidra, there was a blip right when you mentioned the two organizations. Which ones?
Skillful and Tech Hire.
Okay. So yeah, thank you. So what we're learning is about interventions is that there are certain kind of periods or times that work. And so, you know, one is the importance of early childhood. Another is adolescence, when a lot of kids are in trouble. And one crucial one is vocational training or job training, or ways that propel people into, you know, give people skills so that they compete in the labor market. And a lot of the, you know, 15 years ago, we really, you know, people would say, oh, this is a great organization. Now we have evidence because these have been carefully studied. And so we know that outcomes really are better. And for example, in the case of job training, you know, we talked about family structure. You know, one of the things we've learned is that telling kids to get married before having kids does not work. Or telling people to get married does not work. What does improve family structure outcomes is helping young men in particular get decent paying jobs. And then it turns out that they are more likely to, you know, to get married and have kids in the context of a two-parent household. And your point about the compassion, you know, I always think that we're just so hung up about this issue of personal irresponsibility and bad choices. And in another context, driving, you know, Deidra, we know that that often car accidents are caused by bad choices. People drive too fast. They text while they drive. Maybe they drink and they drive. But we, as a society, invest huge resources in mitigating the consequences of bad choices. So we have airbags and seatbelts and divided highways and roundabouts and lit highways, and all that is so that when people make dumb decisions, they're less likely to die. And you know, if we were pursuing the social policy approach, we would put spikes in dashboards so that they would really learn a lesson when they drove too fast. And you know, of course, we just think that would be just horrendous. That'd be gratuitously cruel. But that's in social policy, we put the equivalent of spikes and dashboards to really teach people a lesson.
And we know that those lessons are devastating for people, depending on where you are on the socioeconomic status, right? Where you live, because some people, the spikes are not there for the same crime or the same dumb decision that you make. And as kids, you only make dumb decisions because you don't have life experience to tell you that this is a dumb decision. But you shouldn't have to die for that decision, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of the origin of the title of Tightrope, that, you know, I kind of felt that I was on this nice, smooth path. And so I was much less likely to stumble. And if I did stumble, then, you know, I'd be able to pick myself up again. But a lot of my classmates, they literally were on a tightrope, and a lot of kids around the country are on a tightrope. And they're more likely to fall. And when they fall, there's no safety net. And that's why a quarter of the kids on my old bus are dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide.
So
And
let me stop you. Why not you? What happened that made it different for you? You rode the same bus, you drank the same water, you breathed the same air, you lived down the street, you played with those kids. So what happened to you? Why did you not go down this road?
so it's all about the family that I grew up in. So I had, a loving mom and dad. I was surrounded by books, by expectations that I would graduate from high school, that I would go to college. We often, as metrics of child poverty, we use income, or we use wealth, but maybe you know, the best metrics of child poverty are how often a child is read to, how often a child is hugged, um, how often a child sees the parents, getting in a physical fist fight. Um, and I think that, if I'd been in the Knapp household and seeing my mom getting beaten up every night by a drunken father, I think, I would have been traumatized with no books in the house. I think, I might well have had Farland's outcome, and if Farland had been in my household, he might have had mine. Uh, I think so much just depends on the context that you're in, and our outcomes in life so much depend on where we start.
And that sometimes it's luck of the draw. Sometimes it is luck of the draw, as well as, for me, when I read your book and I look at what's going on, and I wonder, is any of this hereditary? If is there without luck, will this continue to be the outcomes for children in Yam Hill? You're there now, and you've got a farm, and you grow apples and grapes, I believe, a vineyard, right? And so you're hiring some people, and I would imagine you're hiring the nieces, nephews, cousins, grandkids of the Knapps and the Greens, that were your childhood friends. And so are you really thinking about the what I like to call the Covey, begin with the end in mind? Are you looking at your farm as a way to change the trajectory for the Knapp and Green kids and other kids that are there in Yam Hill?
Yeah, so as we were working on Tightrope, we used to have a cherry orchard, pie cherries, and people, they just weren't eating enough cherry pie. We had a lot of trouble selling the cherries, and so we had to do something. And cherries are not very labor intensive, and so we decided, we want to do something, see if it can help. And so we decided that cider apples and wine grapes are more labor intensive. Maybe they can help create some good jobs in the area. And so, this is our experiment. We'll see. I also want to, I've been incredibly depressing, Deidra, but I also do have a certain amount of hope. And partly, I think that a lot of our really bad social policies were rooted in racism. And it was the idea that, beginning in 1968 with the Southern Strategy, that we don't want to invest in human capital because African Americans will benefit. It'll be Black kids who will benefit, and we want to toss people, we talked about junkies, and we're going to toss them in jail and throw away the key. And as more and more members of the white working class have been struggling from these similar phenomena, there's clearly been much more compassion around the country. And we don't talk about junkies, we talk about people in need of treatment. Mass incarceration has turned the corner, declined, led by Texas of all places. And this is clearly hypocritical. It's clearly a double standard, but
I can assure you.
yeah. But it may be that hypocrisy will also lead to policies that actually are better for American kids. COVID, I think, has also, underscored the weaknesses of the fact that we are the only advanced country in the world that doesn't have universal health care. It doesn't have universal paid sick leave. And in many ways, I think COVID and the Trump administration have underscored the failures of 50 years of social policy that has been all about personal responsibility and not about investing. And I sometimes think that the 1932 election in the U.S. that, Franklin Roosevelt was elected with a mandate and flipped the Senate that year because Herbert Hoover's policies were so clearly a disaster. I wonder if something similar may not happen in 2020.
Yeah, I have hope that that COVID will really open our eyes and remove the calluses up from our sight of who should be successful, who should be thriving, who should have any kind of quality or right, who has the right to breathe here in the United States, right? And COVID kind of leveled the playing field for a lot of people because a lot of people are out of work. Unfortunately, a lot of people have died, and without COVID would still be here with us today. And the policies have come to full light around the way that we are treating people in this country. And it is devastating, but the hope, the silver lining, if there is such a thing, is that now policies will change, outcomes will be different, because we see that having such strong policies that are really built out of making sure that there's a segment of our society that doesn't get something, that doesn't prosper, that doesn't move forward, that those are policies that just can no longer stay on our books, right? Stay as part of who we say we are as Americans. In your book, and I agree with you that we talked a lot about some of the down pieces, but your book also offers hope. And towards the end, you have this appendix where you share 10 steps you can take in the next 10 minutes to make an individual difference. And I really like that. It spoke to me because you also say humans are moved to help individuals, not address structural problems. And I think there's a lot of truth there. It is easier for me to help one or two people that I see every day or that are in my sphere than it is for me to try to attack a system, because I may not have the tools available to me or even known to me to dismantle a system. And so, talk a little bit about this appendix, because you start us off with Dee Nap is running across this field and her husband is shooting at her, and Farland throws a sleeping bag down to her out of this window so that she doesn't have to sleep in the dirt and in the cold, but obviously this is something that has happened over a period of time for them to have this skill set, right? So she knows she's not going to get killed and she's going to survive another night. And then you take us through many other people. There is Daniel McDowell, Ethan Green, Marquita Abbott, to name just a few. And I want to ask you at the end, what's going on with them if you know. But talk about these 10 steps that somebody can take in 10 minutes. Why did you put, and I think I know the answer, why'd you put so much hope at the end of this just very sobering book about if we're not careful, we're going to fall apart, and we're already coming apart at the seams, but it's just going to be total, complete devastation. Talk to me a little bit about the hope.
So the point of Tightrope was partly to remind everybody of all those Americans who've been left behind. And I know I thought a lot about the fact that I spent a lot of time covering Iraq and Afghanistan, and those were important stories. But every 2 weeks in America, we lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, these deaths of despair, than died in 19 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't think that we in the news media adequately covered that daily toll of Americans, the daily dysfunction in so many households, the fact that 1 in 7 American kids is living with a parent with a dependency issue, and the challenges that come with that. And so partly it was to explore the other America, but we don't just want to inform people. We want to galvanize people to help, to make a difference. And so, you know, some of the things are really simple. I mean, mentoring. So one of the things we talk about is, how many kids need mentoring, and that's especially true of boys, and that men are not always as eager to volunteer to mentor. And there, even in times of COVID, that can be done. There are groups like iMentor. One can go to imentor.org and be involved in mentoring. One can be involved in policy advocacy for those who don't have that voice. And so groups like results.org, just a great organization that supports investments in kids. And so on. So we really hope that people will not just feel they understand issues better, but also help engage and help make a difference.
So I want to pick up on something that you talked about a second ago. You've written 4 other books, and you are a journalist. So 2 things. My first question is about, and I hate to ask the question, but I'm going to, fake news. As a journalist, talk to me a little bit about fake news. Nothing in your book is about fake news. I mean, this is really what's happening in America, what's happening in Yamhill specifically. But things get out there and they get twisted and co-opt to fit a message. If someone were to read Tightrope and say, you know what, that's just a liberal, leaning, wailing, a crying book about not holding people personally responsible for their outcomes. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. Look, journalists make mistakes all the time. I've made a zillion, and I think, we should avoid being defensive about it and being transparent about correcting mistakes. But I think what we've seen in the last few years with that term fake news is really something broader. It's an attempt to attack the arbiters of truth in American society. It's an attempt to discount the referees of public debate, and to blur the idea that there is any attainable truth, that everything is just versions of reality. And to me, I spent years living in China, covering China. This is kind of what communist systems try to do, that they try to blur any sense that there is any real reality out there. And there's been a similar attack on judges, on the civil service, on courts, the legitimacy of all the arbiters of debate. I wondered a little bit when Tightrope came out how the local community would react, because most people here are conservative. They are Trump voters, and my solutions tend to be more liberal. But everybody, and also it's kind of embarrassing, for people who love Yamhill to talk about all the drug use, the dysfunction, in some cases, domestic violence, even sexual violence. And yet, I think that people reacted in a very healthy way, and they recognized that these were real problems. And I think that whether it's in Yamhill or in Baltimore or anywhere else, what people want is not sympathy. What they want is respect and understanding. And my neighbors here felt that they got that sense of respect and understanding, that and that was kind of all they wanted. That when you asked about Clayton Green, I think the Greens felt that, yes, we talked about some dumb things that he had done and the cooking meth, et cetera, but that we portrayed him as this complicated, talented, loyal person who sometimes screwed up. And that's what Yamhill is. That's what Baltimore is. That's what Kentucky is. That's what America is. And at the end of the day, we do share the same boat. And America can't live up to its potential if so many Americans don't live up to theirs.
Yeah, one thing I will say about the book is you tell some very real and hard stories about Yamhill and other people in your book, you know, some truths that I don't know if it were me, what I would want that in the book, but, you know, and I get that they were brave and they allowed you to have a peek into their life. But the book doesn't leave me, or it doesn't leave one with the feeling like, oh, poor them. If it wasn't for that, you know, this wouldn't happen. It didn't leave me with that kind of mindset or feeling. It left me feeling really, you know, therefore, but for the grace of God, go I. Because any of us could have a situation much like the Greens and the Naps have found themselves in, and others in the book. But it really galvanized me into what could I do to make it different for someone else. And it's not necessarily, you know, even someone in my own family, because of course we want to help family, but someone that's in my community. I like working in my community, getting to know my community, and seeing a difference, a positive difference. And so that's where the book left me with, okay, how do I take what you're saying, knowing that these stories are stories that are shared by many, many, many people. But how can I, Deidra Dennie, go out in the world of Lexington, Kentucky, and make a difference for someone? It doesn't have to be for the whole neighborhood. It doesn't have to be for the whole, I'm here on Transylvania University's campus. It doesn't have to be for the entire campus. It just, you know, one person or one family, how do I make a difference? And that stuck with me. And, you know, and I think that at the end of the day, the 10 things that you share, but just the feeling that I had after I read the book was, it was positive. It was a way to see things in a very different light and see some positivity that could happen with individual action. Now, I don't have to pull myself up by my bootstraps, but I can individually do something and make a change. And I appreciated that. You know, the 4 books that you've written, are they to stand on their own, or are you trying to build this body of work with connections between each books? You talked a little bit about the one that you wrote about China. Is there connections here?
You know, I think that the broader connection is what we can do to create opportunity. So one of our books, for example, was Half the Sky, was about empowering women worldwide. And it was about the injustices that so many women and girls worldwide face, but also just the loss to the world that so many girls don't get educated, can't join the labor force. And in some, you know, this tightrope in some ways is an American reflection of that same problem, that the Naps and the Greens had enormous talent and that could never be realized. Sort of the aphorism that we often repeat is that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And that's true of a girl in Afghanistan who can't get an education. And it's true of a kid in, you know, parts of New York, or in southern Texas, or in Yamhill. People of every complexion, people of every background, and at some level they are the most, you know, they themselves lose, but we as the country lose too. You mentioned the things people can do to make a difference. One of our favorite stories from Tightrope was of a girl who was growing up in Oregon at the same time I was, a friend of ours, a girl named Anne, from a working class family. And she, senior year, she was in the corridor, and her English teacher, Mrs. Converse, stopped her and said, "Anne, you know, where you're going to college?" And Anne said, "Oh, you know, I can't go to college. We can't afford it." And Mrs. Converse took her to the office and said, "Anne, you know, you really should fill out this form, the University of Oregon," and kind of browbeat her into applying. And so she did, and she got a scholarship, and that was a time when you could still work your way through college. And Anne, you know, she worked as a hotel maid, she worked in the cafeteria, graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in journalism, began work at a local TV station, worked her way up. And it was Ann Curry, who later became anchor of the Today Show. And it was all because Mrs. Converse, you know, stopped her in that hallway and nudged her. And it just made this transformative impact in Ann Curry's life. And I don't think that there's enough of that.
It's the individual difference that she made for Anne, right? It wasn't that
Exactly.
expected Anne to give her anything back. She didn't have this expectation that Anne owed her anything. It was, she recognized that Anne was bright and that Anne could have a different kind of future other than what was maybe already written. But it took Anne to have the intestinal fortitude to fill out the form, for college, because she was late, if I remember in the book. So a lot of
Exactly.
application processes had ended, but University of Oregon was still open, and she's the only one she filled out, and she went for it. And then she's Ann Curry, the beautiful Ann Curry that we see today, one of my favorite TV casters, to be honest, newscasters. And so, but that was the piece, and out of the whole entire book, it was that one piece that said to me, you just don't know the impact you can have on someone's life if you give them a little kindness, compassion, and empathy. You don't have to give them money. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time. It is just having a concern that, things are going to be okay. And I appreciated that. So while the book starts off different,
Yeah.
very different, it ends on a positive note. So my very last question for you today, because I really appreciate this conversation, it was great, but I'm just curious, what happened with Daniel McDowell? What happened with Ethan Green? Like, is he working on the farm there? And Marquita Abbott, who had got this apartment that had a kind of a pricey price tag on it, but she was determined to live there. Any updates on any of those folks?
Yeah. So Marquita Abbott, who was she was able to get a new home because of a program in Washington, and that was incredibly important because also she has a child. And homelessness is a really difficult problem, but we know what works to chip away at it, and it's part. Marquita was working full-time, but she still couldn't afford housing. And, partly that's about raising wages and helping giving people job skills. And if we were able to reduce veteran homelessness by half under the Obama administration, if we cared enough about child homelessness, we could reduce that by half as well. Daniel became addicted to drugs in Afghanistan, or after an injury in Afghanistan. And he was homeless, and he benefited from that Obama era program to reduce veteran homelessness, partly by addressing his addiction issue. And he has been off drugs now for, maybe 4 years now. He's doing very well. And he will contribute so much to society as a result. Ethan we mentioned Clayton Green, my friend. Ethan is Clayton's son. He's had 5 kids, all removed by the state. Example of how these problems are transmitted generation after generation after generation. Ethan is struggling. Since we wrote the book, his girlfriend left him. He's trying very hard to get custody of the youngest child, and that is still in the works. But Ethan is complicated and, again, really smart, but it would have been an awful lot easier to help Ethan when he was a kid and get him through high school and give him job skills, rather than now when he's an adult, and his kids would have been better off as well.
Yeah. There's not a fairy tale ending for everyone, and that's real life.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the reasons why our efforts don't succeed more is that we often start too late, and it's an awful lot easier to help a struggling 3-year-old than it is a struggling 30-year-old.
Right. Well, Mr. Kristof, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Please let your wife know that she's in my thoughts and prayers as she's supporting her mom today, and she couldn't be with us. But this book makes you take a very sobering look at what we've become and what could happen if we just made some incremental changes in the way that we treat people. And I think that that is the silver lining, if you will, the testament of your book. So here's the book. Go out and get your copy today. Tightrope, America's Reaching for Hope. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Great, me too.
Thanks again to Nicholas and Deidra for their participation tonight, and thank you for watching. When this Zoom webinar closes, you'll see a survey pop up. It's 5 questions, and we ask for you to fill that out just so we can get feedback on this event. Stay tuned for more book festival events coming your way next month. You can see the full schedule at kyhumanities.org, where you can register in advance for as many Zoom webinars as you wish, and you can always join us on Facebook Live. Stay up to date by signing up for our newsletter on kyhumanities.org as well. And we just mailed out our magazine. You can sign up to receive that on our mail list on our website too. Next week, you can join us for an author happy hour called Writing the Perfect Crime with authors David Bell, Rhea Fry, Andrew Welsh Huggins, and Dana Ridenauer. We'll see you next Thursday.